It was the kind of town where the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the warmth of the sun, where children laughed as they raced down the streets, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries as they went about their days. Chapel Hill, North Carolina, was a place where life seemed to stand still, tranquil and predictable. For many, it was the ideal setting, an idyllic suburban town with cozy homes and tree-lined streets. The centerpiece of this small community was the local church, a towering beacon of faith where families gathered every Sunday for services, potlucks, and celebrations. To outsiders, Chapel Hill felt like the epitome of peace, a small world untouched by the chaos of the outside. But beneath the surface of this perfect facade, there were cracks. And in the Marshall family, the cracks were beginning to show. Emily Marshall, a devoted 30-year-old wife, spent her days wrapped in the comfort of routine. She helped her husband, Thomas, with whatever he needed, organized events for their church, and cared for their home as best as she could. From the outside, everything about her life appeared flawless. She had a loving husband, a stable home, and a community that embraced her. But, like the town itself, there was an undercurrent of something missing, something that neither she nor Thomas dared acknowledge. Thomas, Emily's husband, was a man of duty. He was everything a wife could ask for, responsible, reliable, and always there when needed. But there was a distance between them. A coldness, perhaps, that had slowly crept into their marriage. It wasn't that Thomas didn't love Emily. It was simply that his devotion to his work, his commitment to the church, and the weight of his responsibilities had pulled him away from the warmth they once shared. They no longer spoke the way they used to. The late nights he spent at the hardware store, the long hours at church events, it all created a growing space between them, one that Emily felt more acutely with each passing day. The connection they once had, filled with laughter, shared glances, and tender touches, had turned into something routine, something functional. There was no passion. No spark. Only the distant hum of day-to-day life. And Emily was beginning to notice it more than ever. In the quiet corners of their home, she would find herself staring out the window, lost in thoughts of what had once been. She yearned for more. She longed for the days when Thomas had looked at her with admiration, when their love had been all-consuming, when her heart had raced every time he touched her. But now, she felt invisible. Like a shadow walking beside him, existing but never truly seen. One Thursday afternoon in April, as the trees began to bud and the scent of fresh earth filled the air, Emily found herself standing in the church's lobby, exchanging small talk with the familiar faces around her. That was when he walked in, James Marshall. Thomas's cousin, returned from his travels abroad after years of being away. His arrival was nothing short of dramatic. With his tan skin, wild, unruly hair, and confident, carefree smile, James was a stark contrast to the stoic Thomas. He carried the energy of someone who had lived, truly lived, outside of the rigid confines of their small town. His stories were fascinating, filled with tales of faraway places, of adventures and thrills. As he spoke, Emily found herself drawn to him, her attention slipping away from the conversation she was supposed to be having. There was something about him that stirred her, a sense of freedom, of adventure, of a life that was vibrant and unpredictable. Emily tried to brush it off. After all, he was just family, right? But as he smiled at her, his eyes lingered a moment too long, and something shifted within her. That moment, brief as it was, changed everything. Emily sat in the living room of their house, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm but almost too quiet light over the room. The house was beautiful, charming, even, with its white picket fence, large windows, and the scent of freshly baked bread lingering in the air. It was everything people in Chapel Hill admired, a picture-perfect family home. But as Emily looked around, it felt more like a stage, a facade where she played the role of a content wife while her heart slowly broke behind closed doors. Thomas, her husband of nearly 8 years, walked in after another long day at the hardware store. He was still dressed in his work clothes, worn boots, a plaid shirt, and the same stoic expression he wore every evening. His strong arms, built from years of hard work, carried the weight of the day as he set down his tools and stepped inside, barely looking at Emily as he made his way to the kitchen to grab a drink. "Hey," Emily said softly, trying to bring some warmth into the room. "How was your day?" Thomas glanced up at her, giving her a tired smile. "Same as always. Busy, but good." He didn't stop moving. The clink of glass against counter filled the silence between them, both of them knowing that this was how it had always been, the same routine, the same small gestures, the same disconnection. Emily's heart ached with the quiet. She watched him, his back turned as he poured himself a glass of water. The man she had once adored, the man she had promised to spend forever with, seemed like a stranger. She had tried for so long to make their life together work, to fill the silence with laughter, to reconnect with the man she married. But it wasn't enough anymore. The spark between them was gone. She wasn't naive. She knew it. Their marriage had become a business arrangement, one based on duty, not love. Thomas worked, she kept the house, and they both went through the motions as if it were normal. What they once had, the late-night talks, the stolen kisses, the feeling of being utterly and completely seen, had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Thomas was a good man. There was no question about that. He was hard-working, loyal, and kind. He took care of Emily in the way he knew best, by providing, by working tirelessly to ensure their future was secure. He spent his Sundays volunteering at the church, running the Sunday services, helping with the community. To everyone who knew him, Thomas Marshall was the epitome of what a good husband and a devoted man should be. His name was respected, his reputation untarnished. But Emily couldn't help the emptiness she felt every time she sat across from him. He was there, physically, but emotionally, he was a ghost. The space between them felt vast and unbridgeable. She couldn't remember the last time they had shared a real conversation, the last time they had truly connected. It wasn't that Thomas didn't love her, she knew he did, in his own way. But love, as Emily had come to realize, was not enough when it was wrapped in a constant cycle of responsibility and routine. She had tried to reach out to him. She had tried to keep the spark alive, to make him see her again, to remind him of the woman he married. But it felt like pushing against a brick wall. He was always tired, always distracted, always more focused on what he had to do than on who she was or what she needed. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking the silence. He had turned back to her now, concern in his eyes. But it wasn't real concern, not in the way she needed it to be. It was the kind of question you asked out of habit, not genuine interest. "I'm fine," Emily replied, her voice flat, rehearsed. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired." And she was. She was tired of trying. Tired of pretending. Tired of waiting for something to change when she knew, deep down, that it never would. That night, as she lay in bed beside Thomas, she found herself staring at the ceiling, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her chest. She wondered when it had all gone wrong. When had they stopped being a team? When had they become strangers living in the same house? As the clock ticked quietly in the background, Emily closed her eyes, trying to silence the ache in her heart. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going like this. Her thoughts drifted back to James, his smile, the way his eyes lingered on her the first time they met. The connection was undeniable, a sharp contrast to the distance she felt with Thomas. With James, there was no routine. No expectations. Just the pull of something dangerous, something exciting. And that was what scared her the most. It was a cool spring afternoon when James Marshall walked back into Chapel Hill, and with his arrival, the entire town seemed to exhale, as if a breath they hadn't realized they were holding had finally been released. Emily had heard rumors about his return, whispers of his wild adventures abroad, tales of his free-spirited nature, and his uncanny ability to make every room feel alive. But hearing about him wasn't the same as meeting him. She first saw him at church. The large wooden doors of the old chapel creaked as they opened, allowing the late afternoon light to spill into the sanctuary. There, standing just inside the threshold, was James. His presence was magnetic, a tall man with a tan that spoke of endless summers, wild hair that curled rebelliously around his face, and eyes that shimmered with the kind of stories that made you lean in closer just to hear. He wasn't like the other men of Chapel Hill, no, James Marshall was a man of the world. And in that moment, he brought the world with him, its excitement and mystery palpable in every glance. He was dressed in a loose, faded shirt that clung to his broad shoulders, his jeans rugged and worn from travel. Emily could feel the energy in the room shift the moment he stepped inside. He wasn't just another face in the crowd, he was a presence, a force that demanded attention without uttering a single word. As the congregation settled into their pews, Emily couldn't take her eyes off him. He was laughing with a few of the older parishioners, his easy smile causing them to lean in, captivated by the stories he told. His laughter echoed through the church, light and carefree, and it contrasted so sharply with the quiet reverence of the space. Emily found herself caught in the sound, drawn to him in a way that made her pulse quicken. When he finally turned and saw her, there was a brief flicker of recognition in his eyes, though they hadn't spoken in years. He smiled, that same lazy smile that she remembered from childhood family gatherings, but now there was something different in it, a depth, a spark, that Emily couldn't ignore. "Emily Marshall," he said, his voice smooth and warm, laced with the promise of 1,000 stories waiting to be shared. "It's been a long time." Emily stood frozen for a moment before offering a smile of her own. "James, wow, I didn't realize you were back." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her just a second longer than usual. "Just got in this morning. I thought I'd check out the old place, see how everyone's doing." His words were light, but his gaze was heavier, more intense. Emily couldn't help but feel the pull of it. There was an energy about him that made her feel alive, something she hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just someone who had come back to Chapel Hill, he was someone who had come back to her. Over the next few days, James seemed to be everywhere. He came by the hardware store where Thomas worked, offering to help with odd jobs and chatting with customers. He stopped by the church regularly, almost as if he couldn't get enough of the town, its people, its familiar faces. But it wasn't just the town that seemed to draw him in. Every time Emily and James crossed paths, whether in the church hallways or at the local coffee shop, there was an undeniable connection. A tension that neither could ignore. One afternoon, as Emily was volunteering at a church event, she found herself standing just outside the door when she heard his voice. She turned, her heart skipping a beat as James walked toward her, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow on his face. "You always work this hard," he teased, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes bright with amusement. "You're going to wear yourself out, Emily." She laughed nervously, though there was a part of her that wasn't laughing at all. "I like to keep busy. It helps with everything." There was an awkward pause, the silence between them filled with a tension that neither could name. Emily shifted on her feet, suddenly aware of how close he was, of how the air seemed to crackle between them. "You've changed," James said quietly, his tone turning serious. "You're not the same girl I remember from when we were younger." Emily swallowed hard, trying to suppress the flutter in her chest. "People change, James. Time does that. But not always for the better," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't seem happy. Not like I remember." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to explain herself, to tell him that her life was just fine. But the words caught in her throat. How could she explain to him the quiet ache she'd carried for so long? How could she explain the emptiness that had taken root in her marriage, in her life? James leaned closer, his voice dropping to a soft murmur. If you ever want to talk, Emily, I'm here. I've always been here. His words lingered in the air like a promise, something that stirred something deep inside her, a desire she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The lines of her life, her marriage, her vows, had always seemed so clear, until now. And in that moment, standing there with James, Emily realized just how easily they could blur. James was not just a man who had returned to Chapel Hill, he was a storm, a whirlwind of emotion and adventure that had unsettled everything she thought she knew about herself. With him, there were no rules, no restrictions, just the raw possibility of something different. And Emily knew that if she allowed herself to cross that line, she might never be the same again. It started with little moments. Casual conversations that stretched longer than they should have. A smile exchanged here, a lingering glance there. At first, it was nothing more than harmless flirtation, nothing more than two old acquaintances rekindling their connection after years apart. But soon, Emily found herself craving those moments, replaying them in her mind long after they ended. James had a way of making her feel seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't felt in years. When he looked at her, it was like he was seeing into her soul, unearthing the desires and fears she'd buried deep inside. His attention was a gift, one she couldn't refuse. One Thursday afternoon, nearly a week after their first real conversation, Emily found herself walking to the coffee shop across town. She told herself it was just for a quick cup of coffee, a break from the endless list of things she had to do. But when she stepped inside, she saw James sitting near the window, his casual posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. He waved when he saw her, his smile widening. "Emily, you're a sight for sore eyes," he called out, his voice rich and teasing. She smiled, trying to act casual, but the flutter in her chest was unmistakable. "James, what are you doing here?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He was always there, always lurking on the edges of her life now, and somehow, it felt like he belonged there. "Just enjoying the day," he replied, his eyes locking with hers. "And it looks like you needed a break. Why don't you join me?" Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, her mind racing. She shouldn't. She was married. She had responsibilities. But when she looked into James's eyes, she saw an invitation she couldn't ignore, and before she knew it, she was pulling out the chair and sitting across from him. The conversation flowed easily. They talked about old memories, about places he had visited and the adventures he'd had. But as he spoke, Emily found herself listening more intently than ever before, hanging on every word. His voice, rich and confident, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. His gaze never left hers, and Emily could feel the heat between them building, a current that pulsed beneath every word, every casual gesture. "You look different," he said, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Not just physically, but, there's something more." "Something?" "I don't know, restless about you." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Restless?" she echoed, unsure if she wanted to hear the answer. She was afraid of what he might see in her, the emptiness she had hidden so well, even from herself. He shrugged slightly, his smile softening. "Not a bad thing," he added, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sometimes, we need a little restlessness to remind us we're still living." The words struck her like a bolt of lightning, and in that instant, she realized something. James wasn't just talking about her restlessness. He was talking about them, about the tension building between them, the undeniable chemistry that seemed to hang in the air every time they were near each other. She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable yet captivated. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," she said, her voice a little quieter than usual. She hated how vulnerable she sounded, how much she was allowing him to see of her. James leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a half-smile. "I think you do," he said softly, his gaze intense. "You've been lonely, haven't you? For a long time." Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. How could he know? How could he understand the ache she had carried for so long, the emptiness that had grown between her and Thomas? She had buried it so deeply, so well, but in James's presence, it was as if everything she had been hiding came spilling to the surface. Before she could answer, James continued, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You don't have to explain it to me," he said, leaning closer, the space between them shrinking. I can see it. And I think you've been waiting for someone to notice. To remind you that you're still alive. Still worthy of something more." Emily's pulse quickened, and she felt a heat rise in her cheeks. His words were dangerous, too close to the truth. She wasn't just craving attention, she was craving a connection, a spark of life she hadn't felt in so long. And James had become the catalyst for it, his presence like an electric current running through her veins. "You've always been good at reading people," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. James's smile deepened, and he leaned in just a fraction more, his face so close to hers now that she could feel his breath on her skin. "And you've always been good at hiding it," he said softly. "But you don't have to anymore." The moment stretched out, unbearable in its intensity. Emily's heart raced, her thoughts swirling with a mixture of guilt and desire. She knew what this was, knew what he was offering. But she couldn't deny that, for the first time in years, she felt seen, truly seen. Before she could respond, James's phone rang, shattering the moment like glass. He sat back quickly, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry," he muttered, though his gaze lingered on her for a beat too long. "Duty calls." Emily nodded, though she felt the weight of the moment linger in her chest. "I should get going," she said, standing up. "Thomas will be wondering where I am." James rose with her, his hand brushing against hers as he spoke. "Take care of yourself, Emily," he said, his voice low and knowing. "I'll see you soon." As she walked out of the coffee shop, Emily's mind raced. The connection, the pull between them, had only deepened. And she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she was on the verge of crossing a line that could change everything. The days that followed were a blur of confusion, desire, and guilt. Every time Emily saw James, every time his eyes lingered on her a second too long, she felt her resolve begin to slip. It wasn't just that he made her feel alive, it was the way he saw her. For the first time in years, someone had noticed the restlessness simmering beneath her calm exterior. Someone had seen her for more than just the dutiful wife or the church volunteer. James saw her as a woman, not just a role. It was late one evening when she found herself sitting on the back porch of their house, staring out into the growing dusk. The quiet hum of the neighborhood surrounded her, distant laughter from a barbecue a few houses down, the rustling of leaves in the light breeze, and the soft chirp of crickets in the grass. But none of it felt real, none of it felt like it belonged to her anymore. Everything felt distant. It was as though she were floating just above her life, looking down at the person she once was, but no longer felt connected to. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting the stillness. She pulled it out and saw the familiar name on the screen, James. He'd sent her a message. "Can we meet tomorrow? I need to see you." Her heart skipped a beat. Emily stared at the words, her fingers hovering over the screen. She knew what this was, she knew the consequences of what this could lead to. But the ache in her chest, the growing pull she felt toward him, made it hard to breathe. It was a longing that had awakened deep within her, a hunger she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. She wasn't sure anymore whether it was the attention or the thrill of being wanted, but it was all she could think about. The wind blew softly around her, lifting strands of hair from her face as she glanced toward the house, toward the darkened windows that held the life she had built with Thomas. Thomas, who still worked late, who still got up early and left without a word, buried in his work and his duties. And Emily? Emily was alone. Alone in a house full of everything, except what she truly needed. The message from James was a reminder that she wasn't invisible. That she wasn't just a shadow behind her marriage, buried in the humdrum of routine. She was still a woman who could feel passion, desire, and connection. And James, with his laughter and his penetrating gaze, had brought that to the surface. She took a deep breath, her thumb trembling as she typed a reply. "I'll meet you." The moment she hit send, guilt flooded her like a wave. What was she doing? She was married, for God's sake. What kind of wife was she? But she knew that, no matter how much she tried to deny it, she couldn't stop herself from wanting to see him. She couldn't deny the feelings that had taken root, even if they terrified her. She had crossed a line. And in doing so, she had unwittingly set a path in motion that she wasn't sure she could turn back from. The next day, as Emily prepared herself to meet James, she couldn't shake the anxiety twisting in her stomach. She told herself it was just a conversation, just catching up. After all, they had shared a history, hadn't they? They were family, Thomas's cousin. But the reality was, it wasn't just a conversation anymore. It had never been just a conversation. She chose a cafe at the edge of town for their meeting. It was small, quiet, with soft lighting and mismatched chairs that gave it a cozy, intimate vibe. When she walked in, she saw James almost immediately. He was sitting at the back corner, his gaze locked on the door, as though he had been waiting for her arrival. He smiled as she approached, standing up to greet her in that same easy, magnetic way. His presence was like a spark that lit up the room, and Emily couldn't deny how it made her feel. Alive. Seen. Important. "Emily," he said, his voice low and rich, filled with that same warmth she had heard in his voice all those days ago. "I've been thinking about you." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and she smiled nervously, sitting down across from him. I'm not sure what I was expecting." He chuckled softly. "I wasn't expecting you to say yes to this, either." "Why did you want to meet?" Emily asked, her voice softer than she intended, though she didn't regret it. She wanted to know. She needed to know what this was, what it meant. It had already gone too far, she knew, but she needed the clarity, the answer she could no longer deny. James leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense, unblinking. "Because I think you're hiding something. I think you're holding back, and I can't stand to see it anymore." Emily's heart raced. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. He was right, wasn't he? She had been hiding it all, hiding from herself, hiding from her own desires. She had tried to bury the emptiness, to make herself believe that everything was fine. But the truth was, she had been pretending for so long that she didn't know where the act ended and the real her began. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, her voice faltering just slightly. She was terrified to admit the truth, even to herself. Terrified of what that might mean for her marriage, for everything she thought she knew about who she was. James's eyes softened, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw vulnerability in him, an understanding. "I think you do," he whispered, his voice gentle but firm. "And I think it's time you stopped pretending." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, with truth. Emily wanted to deny it. She wanted to shake her head, tell him that this was a mistake, that she was just fine. But she knew she wasn't. She knew that in this moment, everything was slipping away. And as James reached out, his hand brushing hers with the gentlest touch, Emily felt the weight of her choices settle on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. The tension in the house was palpable. It wasn't loud, nor was it overt, but it was there, woven into the fabric of every conversation, every glance, every passing moment. Richard could feel it, even though he couldn't quite name it. His marriage with Emily had always been steady, routine. They'd had their ups and downs, sure, but nothing that couldn't be worked through. At least, that's what he thought. But lately, Emily had been different. He noticed the subtle shifts, the way she'd become more distant during their conversations, her smile not quite reaching her eyes anymore, the long silences that filled their home when they sat together in the evenings. She was there physically, but emotionally, it was like she had drifted far away. Richard tried to convince himself that it was just stress, that maybe she was worn out from church duties or the endless responsibilities of running their home. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He had tried talking to her about it, but she always brushed him off with a vague excuse or a distracted response. Her mind seemed to be elsewhere, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't until one afternoon, as he came home from work, that he saw something that made the knot in his stomach tighten. Emily's phone was lying on the kitchen counter, her screen unlocked. He hadn't meant to look, but as he walked past, a message flashed across the screen. It was from James. His steps faltered. His eyes lingered on the words, the familiar name, James. His cousin. His heart raced as he read the message. I'm thinking about you. Can't wait to see you again soon. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He stood there, frozen, the phone still resting on the counter, the words echoing in his mind. He tried to push the feeling away, telling himself that it was nothing, that maybe James was just being friendly. But deep down, he knew better. His gut twisted with something darker, something more primal. That message wasn't just friendly, it was intimate, personal. He grabbed the phone, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked it. A few more texts from James followed. Each one more suggestive than the last, more filled with longing, with hints of something that went far beyond mere friendship. Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He read them over and over again, as though hoping they would change, hoping they would mean something different. But they didn't. His world, which had seemed so solid just hours ago, began to crumble in front of him. The weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Richard realized that he wasn't just worried about Emily's well-being or the stress she had been under. No, something far worse was happening. His wife, the woman he trusted, the woman he had built his life with, was having an affair. He couldn't breathe. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just uncovered. How could this happen? How could Emily, his Emily, betray him like this? They had a good life. They were happy, weren't they? They were supposed to be a team. The thoughts swirled in his mind, each one more painful than the last. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt dizzy, as though the room itself were spinning. He clutched the phone tightly, the screen now a blur as his vision clouded with anger and disbelief. He needed answers. He needed to confront her. Richard didn't even realize how much time had passed until he heard the sound of the front door opening. Emily had come home, and the sound of her footsteps made his heart pound in his chest. He quickly shoved the phone into his pocket, trying to calm his racing thoughts, but it was no use. The truth was already out. The damage had already been done. When Emily stepped into the living room, she looked at him with the same distant smile she had been wearing for days, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something about her that seemed off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. And now, he didn't need to. The answers were right there in front of him, written in black and white. "Hi," Emily said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Hi," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air, a heavy declaration that neither of them could avoid. Emily looked at him, her smile faltering, as if she sensed the gravity in his tone. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "About what?" she asked, though deep down, she probably already knew what was coming. Richard stood up, his hands trembling as he reached for the phone in his pocket. "About this," he said quietly, holding it up in front of her. "About the messages you've been exchanging with James." The silence between them felt suffocating. Emily's face paled, and for a moment, she didn't speak. She didn't even look at him. Her gaze shifted to the floor, her breath shallow. "Emily, tell me the truth," Richard demanded, his voice low and tight with restraint. "What's going on between you two?" Emily took a step back, her face filled with guilt and shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fail her. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Richard could feel his chest tightening with every second that passed. "I never meant for it to happen, Richard," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." But the damage had been done. The truth was clear, and there was no turning back now. The silence in the living room was suffocating. The words Emily had tried to say hung in the air, sharp and unspoken. Richard stood before her, the phone still clenched tightly in his hand, the messages from James burning a hole through his mind. His chest rose and fell with each breath, his body trembling with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing sorrow. Emily was still standing by the door, her hands clasped in front of her like she was trying to hold herself together. Her face was pale, the once confident woman now reduced to a shadow of her former self. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't dare let them fall. She had been caught. The lie she had built had been shattered, and now the truth stood before her like a cold, unforgiving specter. "I trusted you," Richard's voice broke through the silence, barely a whisper. "How could you do this to me, Emily? To us?" Emily wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the words got caught in her throat. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the pain that she had caused, and it tore at her insides. She had never wanted this. She had never wanted to hurt him, but she had. In chasing after the excitement James had offered her, she had thrown away the one person who had always been there for her. I didn't mean for it to happen," Emily finally stammered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted this. It just happened." Richard's eyes flashed with fury, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles turned white. The words, "just happened," echoed in his mind, each one more infuriating than the last. How could she say that? How could she justify the betrayal? "Just happened?" Richard repeated, his voice rising, the anger finally breaking through. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I didn't see it? I know you, Emily. I know when something's wrong, when you're lying. And now I see what's been going on behind my back. All the while, I've been blind. I've been a fool." He took a step toward her, his face twisted in anguish, his voice shaking with emotion. "You let him in. You let him into our life, into our home. And you think that's okay? You think I can just forgive that?" The accusation hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on Emily with suffocating force. She flinched, as though his words had physically struck her. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she fought to keep them back, knowing she didn't deserve to cry. Not yet. Not after what she had done. "I didn't want this, Richard," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "But I was so lonely. You were never there. You were always working, always gone, and I didn't know what else to do. James, he was there. He saw me. He made me feel wanted." Richard's face contorted in disbelief, the pain in his chest growing more unbearable with each passing second. "Wanted?" he spat, his words laced with venom. "You think that makes it okay? You think that's enough of an excuse to destroy everything we've built? Our marriage? Our life?" Emily stepped back, her eyes wide with fear, but Richard's fury was unstoppable. His anger, the betrayal, everything he had been holding back for months came crashing down on him in an overwhelming wave. "You think it's just about feeling wanted?" Richard's voice cracked, his body trembling with rage. "What about trust? What about loyalty? What about the vows we took?" He threw the phone onto the couch, his fists clenching at his sides. His breathing was ragged, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't control. Emily was shaking now, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming. She had seen the anger in Richard's eyes before, but never like this. This wasn't the man she married, this was someone consumed by rage, by the raw, unrelenting hurt of being betrayed. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, desperate. "Please. I'm so sorry. Please, don't." But it was too late. The rage had already taken hold of him. Richard's movements were sudden and erratic. In one swift motion, he grabbed Emily's arm, yanking her toward him. The force of it made her stumble, and her heart raced as she looked up at him, wide-eyed and terrified. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and uneven. His grip on her wrist tightened, and she could feel the strength in his hands, the anger in every fiber of his being. "You've destroyed me, Emily," Richard growled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave you everything. And you." Before he could finish, Emily pushed against his chest, her breath ragged, her heart pounding with fear and regret. "Let me go," she cried out, but Richard didn't let go. His eyes were wild, a mixture of pain and fury, and for a moment, it felt like everything was slipping away. "I trusted you," Richard repeated, his voice low and guttural. "And you ruined everything." His grip loosened, but just slightly. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull away, but the damage had already been done. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the tension. It all felt like it was collapsing in on her. And then, in a moment of chaotic emotion, Richard shoved her away from him. The force of it sent Emily stumbling backward, and she crashed into the nearby coffee table, knocking it over. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the room, sharp and jarring. She gasped, her body shaking from the sudden impact, her heart racing in panic. Richard stood there, staring at her, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. What had just happened? What had he done? He looked at Emily, crumpled on the floor, her face pale and tear-streaked. And for a moment, everything went silent. The anger, the betrayal, it all seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a deep, gnawing emptiness. He had lost control. He had let the rage consume him. "Emily. I didn't mean," Richard's voice cracked, his body trembling with regret, but Emily didn't respond. She was silent, her face a mask of shock and pain. The room was heavy with the consequences of their actions, and Richard was left standing there, alone in the wreckage of his marriage. The room was suffocating. The shattered pieces of the coffee table lay scattered across the floor, a silent testament to the chaos that had just unfolded. Richard stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides, his heart racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The anger had surged within him, uncontrolled and raw, but now all that was left was a cold emptiness that threatened to consume him. Emily was on the floor, her back pressed against the overturned table, her face pale and streaked with tears. She stared at him, wide-eyed, as though she couldn't quite believe what had just occurred. The shock on her face was mirrored in Richard's own expression. His breath was heavy, his chest rising and falling as he stood, motionless, unable to tear his gaze away from the woman he had loved for so long. In that moment, the weight of his actions sank in. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had let his anger take over, and now, it felt as though he had lost everything. The woman he had married, the family they had built, all of it seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. "Emily," Richard's voice cracked, his words barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't. I don't know what to do anymore." Emily remained silent, her body trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold it all together. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret. She had never imagined it would come to this. She had never imagined that her choices, her affair with James, would lead to this moment, the violent confrontation that had shattered her world. "Look at what you've done," she finally whispered, her voice raw and breaking. "Look at what we've become." Richard took a step forward, his hand reaching out, but stopped himself just in time. He couldn't touch her. Not now. Not after what had just happened. The trust between them was gone. It had been torn apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the bitter remains of their love. Emily's eyes flickered toward the door. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape the suffocating weight of the situation, but her body was frozen. She couldn't move. Not after everything that had happened. Not after she had allowed herself to betray Richard so completely. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, the words barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Richard stood still, the silence between them deafening. His mind was a storm of emotions, rage, sorrow, guilt. The guilt was the hardest to bear. He had hurt her. He had broken something in her that could never be fixed. And in doing so, he had destroyed whatever was left of their marriage. He glanced down at his hands, the weight of what he had done settling heavily upon him. The pain he had caused, the trust he had shattered, it all felt unbearable. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to lose her. But in his fury, in his helplessness, he had let everything slip away. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," Richard muttered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for things to get this broken." There was no answer from Emily. She couldn't find the words to respond, not when everything felt so fractured, so irreparably damaged. She wanted to apologize, to take it all back, to somehow undo the hurt she had caused. But there was no way to fix it now. She had crossed a line, just as Richard had. The betrayal had gone too far, and there was no undoing the damage. As the seconds stretched into minutes, Richard felt his resolve slipping. He couldn't stand the silence any longer. He couldn't stand to see her in pain, and yet he couldn't bring himself to fix what had been broken. It felt like everything they had built was crumbling around them, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop it. I don't know what to do anymore," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. I can't forgive you for this. I don't know if I can ever forgive you." The words hit Emily like a physical blow, the weight of them crushing her chest. She had never imagined that Richard would say something like that. She had known he was hurt, but hearing him say it, hearing him say that he couldn't forgive her, was the final blow. It was the moment she realized that their marriage, the love they had shared, was truly gone. As Emily sat there, her heart breaking with every passing second, the doorbell rang. Neither of them moved. The sound of the doorbell echoed in the silence, but neither Richard nor Emily had the strength to answer it. The moment felt suspended in time, like they were both trapped in a nightmare from which they couldn't wake up. The doorbell rang again, more urgently this time. Richard finally turned toward the door, his gaze vacant, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. His legs moved without thinking, driven by a force he couldn't control. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling, and opened it. Standing in the doorway was James. The sight of him, standing there with that self-assured smile on his face, felt like the final betrayal. Richard's anger flared again, a mixture of disbelief and fury coursing through his veins. His hand curled into a fist, his body tense with a violent impulse that surged through him like fire. "What the hell are you doing here?" Richard growled, his voice low and filled with rage. James looked at him, unfazed by the anger radiating from Richard. "I came to see Emily," he said casually, as if this was all just a normal part of the day. "Is she here?" Richard's hands clenched tighter, the world around him narrowing to a single, blinding point. He wanted to scream, to throw James out, to demand answers, but he couldn't. The rage had built to a breaking point, and the tension between the three of them was now too much to bear. Without thinking, Richard lunged forward. The confrontation was sudden, violent, and chaotic. Richard's fist collided with James's face, the impact knocking him back, and in that moment, the floodgates of his rage opened wide. The fight became a blur, shoves, punches, grunts of anger and pain. Emily cried out, rushing to intervene, but it was too late. The violence had erupted, and nothing could stop it. James stumbled back, his hand to his bloodied lip, his face contorted with shock and fury. Richard stood over him, breathing heavily, his body trembling with the intensity of his emotions. Emily watched, helpless, as the man she had betrayed stood before her, his eyes filled with anger and regret. The consequences of her choices were no longer just a matter of guilt. They had spiraled into something far darker, something that could never be undone. And in that moment, Emily realized, everything had changed. There was no going back now. She had lost them both. The fight left a silence that felt even heavier than the chaos that had preceded it. Richard stood in the middle of the living room, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His knuckles were bruised from the impact of the punches, and his heart pounded not just from the physical exertion, but from the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. James was no longer in front of him. He had stumbled out of the house, nursing his wounds, leaving Richard alone with the wreckage of his marriage. Emily stood in the corner, her eyes wide, her body trembling, unable to move, unable to speak. The tears that had been building up for so long finally broke free as she collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. What had they become? What had they done to each other? Richard turned toward her, his expression blank, his emotions running wild in his chest. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, more an accusation than anything else. He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He knew the truth now, more than he ever had before. Emily could barely look at him. She wanted to say something, anything that would make this right. She wanted to reach out, to apologize, to tell him that she never meant for any of it to go this far. But the words wouldn't come. The damage was done. The trust had been shattered, the connection had been broken, and the love that once existed between them had dissolved into a heap of lies and betrayals. "I'm sorry," Emily finally whispered, her voice small and broken. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The house felt cold now, too quiet, too empty. The warmth they once shared had evaporated, and in its place was a chilling silence that neither of them knew how to navigate. Emily wiped the tears from her face, her body shaking with the weight of her guilt. She had destroyed everything, and she knew it. She had betrayed the one person who loved her, the one person who had always been there for her. And now, what was left? She reached out for him, her hand trembling, but Richard stepped back. He couldn't look at her anymore. He couldn't bear the sight of her, the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had trusted, now unrecognizable to him. "I can't," Richard choked out, his voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore, Emily." The finality of his words hit Emily like a slap across the face. She had lost him. She had lost everything. And it wasn't just the love they had shared, it was the trust, the foundation of their relationship, that had crumbled into dust. There was no going back from this. She had crossed a line, and now she would have to face the consequences, no matter how devastating they were. As the seconds ticked by, Richard walked toward the door, his back turned to Emily. He paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the life they had built together, the life that was now broken beyond repair. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, his words heavy with finality. "I need space. I need time." With that, he stepped out the door, leaving Emily alone in the shattered remnants of their life. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Emily sat there, still on the couch, her mind numb with the shock of it all. The pain, the guilt, the regret, it all washed over her like a tidal wave. She had lost Richard, and now she had to live with the consequences of her choices. The house, once filled with love and laughter, was now just a place of emptiness, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Emily sat in the silence, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and sorrow. She knew that she couldn't undo the past. She had made her choices, and now she would have to face the consequences. But deep down, she also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She would need to rebuild, not just her life, but herself. Could she ever find redemption? Could she ever rebuild the trust she had lost? And as she sat there in the quiet of the house, she wondered about what comes next. What would the future hold for her now? Could she learn from the mistakes she had made, or was it too late to fix what she had broken? What do you think? What would you do if you were in Emily's shoes? Would you be able to rebuild your life after such a betrayal, or would you walk away like Richard did? And what about Richard? Do you think he'll ever forgive her, or is this the end of their story? We want to know what you think. Leave a comment below and tell us your thoughts. Do you think they could ever reconcile, or is their love lost forever? Let us know in the comments and don't forget to like and share if you found this story impactful.